Hello and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending today's event. My name is David and I'll be the technical assistant for today. Just before we get started, I wanted to quickly review some details with you. First and foremost, I've deactivated your microphones and your cameras. This is to ensure that the lines of communication between Thomas and David are clear throughout today's conversation. Secondly, I want to show you the Zoom interface for those of you that might be new to Zoom. At the bottom, you'll notice that there are buttons, participants, and chat. If you click the participants button, this will show or it will hide the participants list. I encourage you to hide the participants list. That way, the video feeds of David and Thomas are front and center on your screens. If you click the chat button, that will bring up a chat window which will link you directly to me or library staff. So should you have any questions, technical questions, please feel free to send me a message throughout the conversation. Along the top right corner of your screen, you'll notice a speaker view or a gallery view button depending on your Zoom layout. I encourage you to click that button to understand what the different Zoom views are. One of them will show just the speaker's video feed who is talking, whereas the other one shows all the videos on the same screen. So it's really personal preference. I encourage you, or I recommend using the speaker view. That way you're always getting the feed of the person who is talking. One last thing I'd like to discuss with you is the fact that today's conversation is being recorded. It will be uploaded to YouTube after the fact. It will also be streaming live on Facebook as the event is unraveling before us. So should you get disconnected or if you have to leave halfway through by any chance, please know that you will be able to access the video at a later date. Alright, I'm going to pass the floor off to Devin Jones, who is going to do introductions.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Zoom. I'm Devin Jones, Chair of the County of Prince Edward Public Library and Archives. We're being joined here today by David Frum and Dr. Thomas Harrison for a discussion of David's latest book, Trumpocalypse, a look at the potential destruction of democracy in the United States we're all observing with horror and dismay on a daily basis, thankfully from afar. David is a senior editor at The Atlantic, past chair of the leading UK centre-right think tank Policy Exchange, and speechwriter and special assistant to President George W. Bush. He's written 10 books, including Trumpocracy and What Happens Afterwards, Trumpocalypse. He has a family home in Prince Edward County and is a valued supporter of our library system. Tom has a PhD in law from Queen's University and makes his home in Cherry Valley. He's a lawyer, farmer, educator, and writer, past counsel to the Ontario Superior Court of Justice, and adjunct professor at Queen's, presently teaching critical thinking and animal law at Durham College, and serving as chair of Prince Edward County's Recreation Outreach Centre, focused on the county's youth. Thank you for being with us today, David and Tom. I'll turn Zoom over to you.
And such a pleasure to talk to friends in Prince Edward County.
Most will know that David and his family have a residence here. Devin mentioned that. Quite aside from the book, David regularly contributes a column to The Atlantic, and I encourage you to read the odyssey of David's return trip to Canada, in which he describes coming back to the county and the differences between Canada's response to the current public health crisis in the United States, which I think touches upon some of the leadership issues that are highlighted in Trumpocalypse. Would you say so, David?
Yeah, I mean, the pandemic brought to the fore both many of the personal problems with Donald Trump, but also some deep problems in the government that Donald Trump has headed. One of the things I think we've really learned from watching pandemic response around the world, and not just the Canada-US comparison, but that of so many other countries, is that after the initial shock and surprise and uncertainty that struck the world in February, March, and April with all of the terrible toll, and where many people made mistakes because they didn't know what to do, that most democratic governments got an adequate grip on the crisis by the enemy, beginning of June. They found ways to keep their economies going, even though people were locked out. And they found ways to bring down the rate of infection and the rate of disease, some more than others, but that's the direction in which everybody went. And there are three standards: the United States, Sweden, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And each failed in different ways. But the American failure has been by far the biggest. And that's a personal failure of Donald Trump, but it also indicts some ways that the American system goes wrong that are the subject of Trumpocalypse.
Right. And, the Trumpocalypse book, when I read it, first of all, let me just say how much I really enjoyed reading this book. As much as the Trumpocracy book, it's a great follow-on and sequel to that. I noticed that the book really highlights some dualities, between success and failure, obviously, just like you've described, but also, between America and amongst Americans, but between America and the rest of the world. And then there's also sort of America, the general population, and individual stories. And I would just like to spend a second and quote something that you said near the end of the book, because you actually turned towards a very personal view that I kind of went wahoo when I read it, because I think it's one that's probably shared by many people. So if you don't mind, I'd just like to read a little bit from the last part of your book. You say in chapter 12, over the past 4 years, I have thought and spoken and written about Donald Trump almost more than I can bear. You probably feel the same fatigue. We are all just exhausted with this worthless man. We want things to return to normal, back to a world in which we do not have to waste time rebutting demented conspiracy theories and checking farcical lies every single day. We want a government that operates competently and honestly, headed by a president who behaves with dignity and integrity. And I think that is that part of the failing in leadership that speaks to the pandemic, but also to the other issues that you highlight in your book.
Yeah. Well, the failing leadership, look, I'm going to experience this sometime around the end of August. I'm going to drive back to the United States, and I'm very curious about what that experience will be like. Because when my wife and I crossed the border into Canada, and travel is very restricted. We crossed at the Thousand Islands. There are normally 9 lanes open, 8 of them were closed. And although there was only one car ahead of each, we drove separately, but there was one car ahead of each of us when we arrived. It still took 15 minutes to cross because there was a lengthy questioning. And the questioning, we're both born in Canada, both my wife and I, so of course we have the right to enter. So that wasn't what the questioning was about. But the officer, who was wearing quite sophisticated masking equipment, wanted to know our plans. How are we going? And had very specific questions, like my wife was traveling with 2 of our dogs. How would the dogs be walked? And I had a different officer. She wanted to know from me, how were we planning on feeding ourselves in the county? And I could show her that I had a big supply of groceries in my little truck with me, and that we would be eating that way. And they took our phone numbers and our email addresses, and we then got either a text or a robocall or a human call every day for 14 days. Wow. And it wasn't snoopy. I mean, actually, especially the robocalls were very sort of positive reinforcement. Thank you for what you were doing for the public health. And then they began at about the halfway mark to count down, 6 days remaining, 5 days remaining, and so on. But there's a lot of social science that shows that people behave differently when they think other human beings are watching them. They behave better. And that's the theory. That's why you can leave your door unlocked in a small town. Everyone knows everyone else. And so it isn't that small town people are inherently different from big city people, but they just feel more awareness of the other people around them. So I'm going to be curious whether anything like that happens when I cross the border into the United States the other way. And I don't believe it will. And that's not just Donald Trump's personal fault, that something went wrong with larger systems of U.S. government. And Trump was obviously the first mover, but there are some deeper causes. Can I say a word, because you kindly compared the 2 books? I didn't know when I wrote the first that I was going to be writing a 2-part series, although I guess maybe I did, because they're in dialogue with each other. And the 2 titles talk about what this series is about, because the first, Trumpocracy, derives from the Greek word for rule or power. It's the study of how did Donald Trump get power and how is he likely to use it. And Trumpocalypse comes from the Greek word meaning a revelation or a glimpse of the future. And it first looks back on how the power was used and then tries to assess the ways in which the system failed and ways to go forward. But Americans are going to have to understand, despite that poignant, those feelings that we share about wanting this all over, it's not going to be so easy to go back to normal. Normal will have to be built.
Right. And so for those of you who are interested, there's a screenshot of the book. Yeah, I think you're seeing it in reverse, but that's what it looks like. So you can see the cover when you go into your bookstore. I should say as well that in addition to many copies being available at the Prince Edward County Public Libraries, which you should reserve as soon as you can, if you want to purchase a copy here in Prince Edward County in Picton on Main Street, we have a great independent bookseller, Books and Company, and they have multiple copies of the book. And I think, David, you've signed a few, I think, as well.
Well, in fact, look, I don't know that if anyone's ever interested in this, but the 35 books in Books and Company in Picton have the distinction of being the only books in the entire all of North America that I actually signed in the book itself. That we printed up a bunch of adhesive book tags, and we gave away some, and I've been mailing others to people who asked for them. But the only 35 books that I actually signed, and probably am likely to sign, are in Picton, Ontario. So if such a thing as book collecting exists in the 21st century, in this age of electronics, I don't know. That's a little footnote in book history.
Instant collector's item.
Yeah.
So I say there were some dualities in the book. That the book, I think you mentioned, or kind of referred to it. The book actually breaks down into two sections. The first section sort of looks at where we are, and the second section, in keeping with the title of a revelation or hope or a new beginning, looks at and provides some prescriptive advice about where we're going and how to maybe address the things. I think the book is, and you say it is, so that's why I think it. The book is united in all its sections and parts, in all its dualities, with one big theme. And that's, to paraphrase your words, David, that Trump took advantage of a system that has inherent weaknesses. I think if you could just talk a little bit about that, what those are, and give us an example.
Well, since I see most people listening to us today are Canadian and are looking from a Canadian point of view, I want to make a point about American life that I think it's easier for people outside the United States to grasp than Americans. We all know this phrase, American exceptionalism, and that is often used to mean American bestness. That American exceptionalism means top nation. But when the concept of American exceptionalism was being sort of developed in the 19th century, it wasn't a compliment. It began just as an attempt to explain something. The United States seemed to be on a different path from the other advanced industrial countries. And at different periods in history, the question has been, what is that different path? But it began as a kind of more neutral observation that there were things about the United States that were just different from the other developed countries. At the beginning, one of those things was the United States was a democracy, or a white democracy, and most other advanced countries were not. But since World War II, we've all been more or less democracies, but yet there are real differences. And so, and some of those differences are obviously to America's enormous advantage. Back during the boom days in Silicon Valley, there was the saying in the Valley, the thing that made the United States the greatest country on earth was it was the only place where you could borrow $100 million without owning a suit. And so there is a kind of creativity and dynamism to American life that I think everybody admires. There's a kind of creative rule breaking that in the bad context can lead to a lot of financial fraud, but in the good context can lead to innovation and creation, and that's the reason why the whole world dances to American music and wears American blue jeans and admires American pop stars and reads American books and American art because of that innovation. But one of the things that the different path has meant, and this is very relevant to the COVID crisis, is the United States government is very conservative government in the sense, in the literal sense of that term, is that it doesn't adapt as well to the new world. So a lot of the United States is dragging 19th century behaviors into the 21st century, and this is one that's very appropriate. The United States doesn't have a civil service the way Canada or Britain or Germany or Australia has a civil service. If you're a minister in Ontario or in Canada and there's a crisis, you turn to your civil servants and say, has anyone ever thought about what we should do? And then they open the drawers and they have developed plans. And maybe the plans are not the most brilliant thing ever. And maybe there's something kind of predictable and routine about the way bureaucracy works. But the fact is you have this giant planning capability that's waiting for whoever wins the election. And then the politician can take the plan and say, well, I'm a socialist, or I'm a conservative, or I'm a liberal, or I'm a green, so I'm gonna strike out this. This thing I'm pulling up from the bottom and this thing I'm taking out, but I work within something that already exists. Well, the United States doesn't. I mean, the equivalents of deputy ministers and assistant deputy ministers in the United States are all political appointees, chosen for their loyalty to the president. And even in a very business-like administration, even in a very, an administration that's trying to be honest, that whether it's Barack Obama or George H.W. Bush, whichever president you think was doing the job properly, when they are taking on deputy and assistants, they do ask the question, what did you do to get President Obama elected or President Bush elected? That's a relevant question to choosing who's going to be Assistant Secretary for Health and Human Services. They do ask. And sometimes you can say nothing, and if you're talented enough or useful enough, get away with it, but it's always there. And that has turned out to be a tremendous liability with this crisis, because the plans don't exist. The plans are in the drawer. But a lot of the drawers vanish into presidential libraries at the end of the administration, and a lot of the people with the expertise vanish into the private sector or back to the universities, wherever they came from. And so, to recreate the knowledge base of government requires a real effort by every president. And if you have a president who's not making any effort, that knowledge base tends to deteriorate. I mean, Donald Trump actively attacked the knowledge base, but it was bound to deteriorate even if he hadn't actively attacked it.
Well, one of the things you're talking about the civil service, and one of the other examples you talk about in your chapter called "Unrigging the System" is the gerrymandering that's occurred, and the results that has caused. And I saw you on Greater Boston the other night with Jim Browd. You did very well. I was impressed. But you mentioned there a point that you also reiterate in the book about 2020 being a particularly important election, and I think the gerrymandering, the cause of it is an issue that in Canada, we have a different system. So if you could maybe just explain why 2020 is important in terms of gerrymandering, that'd be good.
So the US Constitution requires that there be a census every 10 years. And it tends in the years ending with 0, or at least it has been as long as I am aware of it. And the Constitution says also, after that census, there is a redistricting to make not only the federal House, a portion of the seats in the federal House of Representatives, but also that same census is used by the states to apportion their state legislatures. For a long time, the number of people in the House of Representatives has been capped at 435. I forget how far back that goes, but it probably goes back to most of the 20th century. So what these redistrictings mean is some states that have lost relative population will drop a seat or two, and other states will pick up a seat or two, and then you have to draw those boundaries. Now, uniquely in the United States, unlike anywhere else in the world, the boundaries are drawn by politicians. Everybody else, look, there's always, every society that has boundaries, in Britain, Canada, Australia, they have boundaries. The people who don't use list systems, there's always politics. But the politicians are always there trying to shift. They're not running. The American system is one where the politicians do it and they are overseen by the courts. In Canada and other countries, that some kind of so-called independent body or more or less independent body does it, and the politicians then they oversee it. They try to lobby it. And what happened in 2020, in the 2010s, that led to Trump was a series of unexpected events that came together there's a terrible financial crisis in 2008. President Obama is elected in 2008. There is not recovery in place by 2010. So the Republicans do incredibly well up and down the ballot, federal and state, in the elections of 2010. And they then have an opportunity to gerrymander in 2011 on a scale seldom seen. There's usually kind of a balance of terror on gerrymandering, which is, that usually one party will have 28 state governments, and the other will have 22. And so there's just a limit of what you do in your 28 because of fear of what they'll do in their 22. But after 2010, Republicans had a grip on state government unlike anything that either party has had since the Republicans had it in the 1920s. And so they felt disinhibited. Plus, in 2013, the Supreme Court voided big sections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that put some supervision on what states could do to disenfranchise racial and ethnic minorities. So the way was really open for a very extreme gerrymandering in a pro-Republican direction. Now, 2020 is again a census year, but unlike 2008, when the Democrats gained power 2 years before the census, this year they're going to gain power in a census year. And they're going to gain it in many of the states where gerrymandering is most an issue. So the politics of the 2020s could look quite different from the politics of the 2010s.
Right.
But that still doesn't change the inherent evil of letting politicians draw their own districts.
Now, I don't know whether you meant to say that the Democrats were going to win or not. You're much more equivocal in the book, but you've kind of just said when they gain power in the fall. Do you think? Do you have?
I was right in the book. I was right in the book. I was wrong. I shouldn't be so declarative because anything can happen. But I think still the balance of probabilities is that the Democrats do very well up and down the ballot in 2020, not just the presidency, but the state legislatures too. And that's driven both by the magnitude of what has already happened and then some other bad things that are coming. The American equivalent of the economic aid that has put a floor under Canadian incomes, for many people, it expired on July 31st. There was a supplemental unemployment insurance program. In the United States, unemployment insurance is run by the states. It can vary enormously, and it can be very meager in some states. I think in the state of Florida,
you're comparing the American program to the federal government programs here in Canada that has provided income support for people, right?
Exactly. Yes. Okay. Thank you. I'm sorry if that wasn't clear. So when they passed the first round of COVID relief back in, I think, March, the federal government in the United States issued a one-time check for, I believe, if I remember right, $1,200 to every taxpayer,
right?
To every worker, or every adult. I think it was, I think you didn't get it if you were on Social Security, but for everyone who's not on Social Security, you got a $1,200 check. And then they created a federal supplement to the state unemployment insurance of $600 a week, which was enough to, that is the equivalent of earning a $15 an hour wage for 40 hours a week. So it'll keep it's not generous, but it keeps body and soul together. That $600 supplement expired on the 31st of July, and there's no early plan to pass anything new. So that's one thing that is heading toward the way of the incumbents. And the other is, of course, that the school year may not be able to start in August and September. And what a devastating thing that is for families, for parents, and by the way, for many children who are going to find that the inherent inequalities that are always present in an educational system become so much more extreme in a situation like this, because there are many families that will find some way to cope. And there are many other families that will find some way not to. And there are many young people, especially in their middle school years, who are going to lose their year or lose a chunk of the year and then decide not to continue with their high school education when they turn 16 and can drop out.
Yeah, so there's some difficulties coming. The other thing that relates to the civil service is the fact that the civil service is largely, often at the higher levels, political appointments, is that policies are often associated with partisan interests. So, larger principles like rule of law tend to get dismissed as being potentially part of some partisan conspiracy. And you talk about this in the chapter in which you talk about the conspiracy about the deep state in the United States, which I think is also not only in the United States, but also internationally, people's potential reluctance to rely on the American word and their contracts and international relations, that this could be a real problem.
Well, there's a whole chapter on this because I think Donald Trump's harm to America's standing in the world is likely to be one of his most enduring legacies to the United States and the world. I think many of the problems at home, you can see a path to addressing them over the next few years. The international problems are more acute, partly because they're happening at a time when China and such countries are growing so quickly, and the democratic countries' share of the world is inevitably shrinking. And this is a point I made in another book that I published now 15 years ago. But in 1985, when the United States and its allies were on the verge of winning the Cold War, the United States, plus the NATO countries, plus Japan, plus Australia, plus one or two other very friendly countries that weren't in NATO, that group accounted for about half of the planet's economic output. Right now, that same group, which is now reinforced by the countries of Central Europe, it's now reinforced by democratic countries in Latin America like Chile and Mexico, that group of countries produces less than a third of the planet's output. And while the American share has not dropped quite as steeply, the United States, which was about 22% of the planet's output in the 1980s, is now about 17-18% of the planet's output. And to make the point even more dramatically, when I worked in the Bush administration, which is now only not even 20 years ago, depending on who is counting, the American economy was somewhere between 3 and 6 times bigger than the Chinese economy. And today, the Chinese economy is very nearly equal to the United States. So just the balance of power around the world has changed. So America's ability to put together alliances and coalitions matters more than ever. And that is what Donald Trump has done so much damage to.
Yeah. And you talk about this in terms of America's capacity to act, to demonstrate leadership in a practical way. About the challenges we face ahead. I mean, you talked about the economic challenges in the United States, but there's some, big international issues that we're, as a world, are going to have to face. And one of those is climate change. And you talk about that in the book too. I was a little surprised. You are, I think, to be fair, a conservative commentator and have been a conservative most of your life. But you raise an issue that is controversial here in Canada, undoubtedly controversial in the United States, about a carbon tax, and you indicate that you support a carbon tax, that the United States should adopt one. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that and why it's important that America show leadership on this issue.
Well, let me stress here on this, that the very first world leader to speak in private and in public about climate change was Margaret Thatcher. And who was, of course, educated as a scientist, one of the rare world leaders. Angela Merkel's another, who have a scientific background. And when the evidence of this danger was being gathered for the first time in the early 1980s, she was fascinated by it, and she read more and more about it. And she gave a speech to the Royal Society in Great Britain, which is their chief scientific society. She gave a speech about that, and I think about 1985 or 6, if I remember right. And then she, in her last address to the United Nations as prime minister before she lost power at the end of the 1980s, she spoke about it there. And the George H.W. Bush administration was very conflicted about it, and it but they did set in motion a lot of climate work around the Rio conference in 1992. And in the George W. Bush administration, this is a sort of forgotten footnote to history, but there's a huge argument as to what position George W. Bush should take on it. During the campaign of 1999-2000, Bush had given a speech in which he endorsed the idea of regulating climate changing gases as pollutants. And after he came to office, there was I wouldn't say a fierce debate because it was so uneven, but there was a small group within the Bush administration. I think I mentioned their names in the book, of the 2 people who did the most work on this, who are acquaintances, friends of mine. And they lost the internal struggle, but honor to their memory. And I did sort of a lot of the writing around trying. There's a lot of the way you move debate is you propose things that the president might say, and you sort of put them into the channel. I mean, many speeches are written for the president that are never delivered, and many speech fragments are, here's the thing you should consider. And oftentimes it happens that if people like the way something is said, they then become attracted to the underlying idea. And if they don't like the way something is said, it can discredit the underlying idea. Yeah. So it wasn't, I think the defeat of the climate change people in 2001 was probably baked pretty hard into the cake because Dick Cheney was on the other side. But, Dick Cheney lost influence in the second Bush term, and with slightly different events and runs of luck, I think President Bush might have taken the issue more to heart than he was able to do. So I don't think it's it's just a fact. And how where the political differences appear in politics is how do you respond to facts? Rents are going up faster than income. What do you do about that? So if you're on the left, you say we should build some public housing. If you're on the right, you say we should make it easier for developers to build more private housing. Right. Or maybe we should think about a voucher to top up the incomes of people. But so you argue about what to do, but it's whether rents are rising faster than incomes. That is something you can measure. It's either true or it's not true. And maybe sometimes you think somebody's smuggling in a claim, that someone who wants to do public housing is saying something about rents, and then you can discredit it but in the end, they're either right or they are wrong. And then if the point is right, then you have a debate about what to do. And one of the ways that political discussion in the United States has been, I think, especially unfruitful for the past dozen years is they're just things that it's just true. It's just a fact. And then people, rather than come up with politically with solutions that are acceptable to their coalitions and their own sets of ideas, they try to avoid having to come up with solutions by denying the fact. And as we're seeing in this pandemic, facts bite you. Facts will not be ignored. Right. They will make themselves felt. So you'd better be ready for them.
Right. It's interesting because you talk about smuggling in a claim, and in terms of the carbon tax, you say one of the ways that people could lose, well, there's several things that you say in that chapter, how to lose to Trump, right? One of the things you say is it's important that we have a climate plan. You talk about support for a carbon tax, but you also say, if the left is going to also attempt to reorder the regulation of the economy through this, that they might not succeed at either fixing climate change or re-regulating the economy. And so we have to be a little bit careful here, right?
Well, my friend Andrew Coyne, many years ago, wrote a really hilarious column about this, in which he said there are many areas where voters will accept that something needs to be done, but they entrust that something not to the people who want to do it, but to the people who don't want to do it. Because they say, all right, we understand that there are people who are going to use the climate change to try to get us to change our lifestyles in all kinds of ways that we don't strictly have to do. And what we want to do is give this job to the people who are going to say, look, this is what you have to do. But that's this famous Green New Deal that was proposed by some of the left-wing members of the House of Representatives. I mean, it's this, I forget now how many points it has, but it starts really sensible. I mean, it starts with things like the government should incentivize the construction of buildings that that are more energy efficient and do a better job of capturing solar energy. Well, that's a good idea, obviously. And then it goes on to think they get progressively more and more removed. And I'm not saying that these ideas are irrational. For the people who propose the ideas, I'm sure they're highly rational, but they are not directly answerable to the purpose. And you're trying to smuggle in things like that. The idea that maybe the government should guarantee a job to every willing worker. Maybe it should. I don't agree, but maybe it should. Maybe you think so. But you can pretty obviously solve the climate problem without guaranteeing a job to every willing worker. And so if your plan is a climate plan, it should contain things that are about the climate and not try to be a way to say, we've always favored this other thing. And what do you know? It turns out that the solution to the problem today is this other thing that I've been advocating for 40 years.
Right. And so, whether it's international issue like climate change or trade, or one of the others you talk about in the book is migration, immigration. You say that Trump is, a consistent pattern, and I listed out the things that follows the consistent pattern: noisy threats, followed by preoccupation with image, maximal goals, minimal alliances, no apparent strategic plan, no authorization from Congress, and then adverse public opinion. And this has been pretty consistent throughout the Trump presidency.
We're seeing it just this week with the way he handled the TikTok matter.
Right.
So this is a rare case where there's something to say for the Trump point of view. I mean, TikTok is like that program that circulated on Facebook, which purported to age your face, but was actually a way for Russian intelligence to steal all the data.
Right.
On your computer. That there are these programs out there that are authorized by authoritarian states that are fun, but that have other sinister purposes. So what did he do? He said, maximal goals, I'm going to ban TikTok. Well, then it turns out he can't ban TikTok. So then he has a backup plan, but which is, I'm going to force TikTok to sell to Microsoft, and I'm going to make a feed for the federal treasury. But he's not built any coalition for that. It is easy to see how this is something a different president could do, put together a lot of different members of Congress who have different reasons for favoring the idea. So, we don't agree about everything, but here's something, and the president has talked to us and won us over and built a coalition. And we've also, by the way, this is an international issue. So we've also had conversations with our EU and UK and Japan counterparts. Who agree with us that TikTok should be divested and acquired by a different tech company. They don't all love the idea of it being an American tech company, so we have a plan to reassure them on this. And if there's any money involved, that maybe they're either paying some of the costs or getting some of the, those are the kinds of things that they do. And the result is it looks like this TikTok thing is going to be a fiasco. And we are probably going to end up with 6 months from now, TikTok still owned by the Chinese state. People still using it unwarily and still having their data stolen.
Right. You were talking about statistics and the way America is viewed around the world. I took the time to look up the recent Canadian poll, which you may know. 37% of Canadians right now have a favorable view of the United States, and fully 70% disapprove of Donald Trump. The 37% figure is the worst it's been in almost 40 years. And, we have a long history of being the United States' closest friend and ally. And I think if Canadians are feeling that perturbed, it makes me wonder what the rest of the world is thinking, let alone the traditional enemies of the United States like China.
Well, this is obviously, what is so heart-rending about this COVID thing is in many ways you could say, we're going to look back at this and say, COVID was a triumph of the capacities of democratic governments and a triumph of free market economics. I mean, we shut down across the developed world the majority of our economic activity for so far half a year. Probably it will be a year before it's all out. Yeah. And we paid for it by borrowing trillions of dollars from the future. And it worked. It worked. I mean, any other society, at any other time, if you have to shut down your economy for you, people would go hungry. They might starve. But, like everyone's a little worse off. The depression would be up, like the Black Death, like the Irish potato famine, like that. Real hunger. If people like real death, if you stop in an agricultural economy, you don't farm for a year, everyone's dead. So it's a triumph of the organization and our society's ability to move wealth through time, to take trillions of dollars from the future and spend them now, and figure out ways that the future will repay itself, to keep the people who can work as we are working here through Zoom, keep them working, and we're all understanding that those of us who have done okay during COVID, we're facing higher taxes down the road to pay the cost that was of subsidizing the people who were less well positioned. So these are all successes. And then we are having a crash vaccine program that looks like it is going to work and that is going to produce a sufficient vaccine, not just at the fastest pace in the history of vaccine, but 4 times the fastest pace in
4
the history
years,
of
I think,
vaccines. And we did it by,
for months.
yeah, 4 years was the previous record. And we did it by throwing money around on a scale that, I mean, who could imagine that money could be? So these are all accomplishments. These are tributes to the success of our society. And through all of this, the people at the very top of the system, their goal has been to sabotage and to put their ego in place. Anyway, so I think there is some reason to feel hopeful and optimistic about how all this has happened. And when you look at America's standing in the world, that maybe at the end of this, people say, you know, despite everything, they blundered their way through to a successful outcome. But the appearance of competence is really mattered. I mean, the Chinese system is a very unlovely one, but they have convinced people, I think falsely, but they have convinced people that they can do things. And America and its democratic allies, which have done a fantastic job in so many ways, we have looked like we can't do things, and we hurt ourselves by that false appearance.
So, I mean, that's the question about hope and the future. I mean, that touches on the alternative meaning of the apocalypse or Trumpocalypse, which is the revelation, right? And the looking to the future for a new beginning. I mentioned you talked about, you know, getting rid of gerrymandering, but you have some other ideas too. So it isn't just that you're complaining about the president; you're actually looking ahead. And to be fair, I recognize you do say there's going to be some flashpoints in the future. Immigration and some of those international issues are some of the things you talk about. But you also say, you know, there's some specific things we can do: eliminate the filibuster, depoliticize law enforcement. One that I thought was interesting is statehood for DC. But also adopting a modern Voting Rights Act. I wonder if you could just talk about some of those or any other ideas you might have.
Well, the core, the way I think about all of these things is the United States both has very large social and economic problems, and it has small political problems that you have to solve first in order to get to the others. So, you know, the things you mentioned, those are all political solutions, and they're not going to address climate change, and they're not going to address, you know, the slowdown of economic growth in the developed world. They're not going to address the educational deficiencies of the bottom third of the United States. But you will not be able to get to any of those things unless you make Congress work better. Yeah. And so I say, so the step one is to address the political as the precondition for addressing the social and economic. And the biggest problem the United States has is that politically, the biggest political problem is that Republicans have lost confidence that they can compete effectively in a fair democratic competition. And they have addressed that, they should address that, as every other center-right party in the world would, by saying, well, how do we retool? How do we make ourselves more attractive? You know, it's competitive. It's a welcome to the NFL. You're competing for the presidency, you're control the most powerful government on earth. It's going to be hard. And there are people who are always going to try to beat you and take the ball away. So you have to get better. You have to have new ideas. You have to test them. You have to bring up talent from the state level. Instead of doing those things, Republicans have said, well, instead of modernizing our ideas to fit the electorate, what if we shrink the electorate to fit our ideas? And if we can just remove an unwanted portion of the electorate, we will be able then to win with the ideas that don't meet the needs of the majority of the country. And so that is the first thing that needs to be fixed. And all of the ideas you talk about are relevant to that, of making it harder for a minority to exercise power, which a minority should not do in a democracy. You should have to have consent from a majority. So the power of the statehood for DC argument is it's a way, without constitutional change, without doing anything that's really difficult. It's a way that with just a vote in Congress and a signature from the president, you can rebalance the Senate just a little bit in favor of urban America and against rural America.
DC would help that, right?
Well, DC is a city, would be a city state of close to, by the year 2030, close to 800,000 people. Yeah. So that would make it bigger than Vermont, bigger than North Dakota, bigger than Alaska, bigger than Wyoming. And it would be one of the richest states in the country. It would depend much less on federal assistance than, say, Texas does.
Right.
So you'd add two. They would be urban. They would probably be Democrats, and they would probably be Black or Hispanic, and they would come from urban America, which is very underrepresented, and they would rectify a situation where otherwise the Senate is more. I mean, it's never been perfectly representative. It's supposed to represent states, but it has never been as disconnected from population in American history as it is today.
Why not Puerto Rico too?
Oh, well, this is something I think Canadians will get, because Puerto Rico's had a number of votes on becoming a state, and it doesn't have a clear and credible majority in favor of statehood. And in my view, and I didn't say this in the book, and I should have, but you do not want states that are uncertain whether they wish to remain states. I would not let Puerto Rico become. There have been many referendums on this question, and usually sometimes there's a three-way choice, sometimes there's a two-way choice, but you never get the kind of 2/3 majority inside Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has a strong nationalist tradition, and there are many people who want independence. And I would say until you have 67% of Puerto Ricans saying we want to be a state, it's dangerous for Puerto Rico, it's dangerous for the United States. You know, there was a Puerto Rican terrorist movement in the 1940s that tried to assassinate President Truman.
Really?
They committed other crimes in the 1940s. So just it doesn't exist anymore, but just you want to have a sense that people don't become a state unless they signal that they are clearly in favor, the large majority of them, of being a state.
David, you end the book with an appeal, I think, towards the hope and the future, but an appeal that is to say, at one point you say, few of the millions who supported Trump were intentionally bad actors. And it's an appeal for reconciliation, for not just doing what has caused part of the problem, which is an attempt to try to eliminate large sectors of the population, right? But to try to bring people back on side and have less of an us versus them approach.
Yeah.
You want to...
Let me say something of this very much in mind with our Zoom audience today. So if you're watching this conversation on Zoom, you're a very politically engaged person. And you know, in the fractions of 1% of political engagement, if you're watching us today. And you meet in your now, unfortunately, almost completely online life. But I mean, so you're such a person who, even without COVID, would probably be very online. And now, of course, we are all much more online. And so you encounter other highly politically engaged people with different views. And those meetings can be sometimes not very nice. And sometimes you will have people who behave in ways that are, objectionably, really, they're abusive, or they circulate disinformation about healthcare, or they do other, and it's natural that you would emerge from these encounters pretty angry at people who think differently and thinking they're behaving in very antisocial ways. And so I end the book by saying, I want you to sort of remember how not politically engaged most people are, and how not highly online most people are. Now, Donald Trump got 63 million votes in 2016. And some of them came from the people you are having bad experiences with on Facebook. And some of them came from the hosts on Fox News, who are doing all of the reprehensible things that hosts on Fox News. But the great majority of the 63 million votes came from people who are not, just thought it might work out for the best. And many of them are disappointed. And they're not going anywhere. You have to deal with those people as fellow equal citizens. And I'm always mindful of, and I try to be guided by what I think is just one of my favorite passages from American history. And that is the speech that Abraham Lincoln gave. And I quote this toward the end of the book. The speech that Abraham Lincoln gave shortly after he was reelected in 1864. So Lincoln has just won this. He's about to win the Civil War. He's won this re-election victory. A crowd of well-wishers comes to him at the White House to serenade him and congratulate him. And any normal politician would use the moment for a little sort of self-congratulation himself, a little pleasure. Not Lincoln. He gave one of his characteristically gloomy, thought-provoking speeches. But he said about this, looking back on the Civil War, he said that what has happened in this case is just an expression of human nature. And in any future crisis, we shall have, just as we had in this one, good people and bad, wise and foolish, caring and uncaring. And that's just the way human beings are. And so let us try to look back on what we just lived through. None of this as wrongs to be revenged, but all of it as philosophy to learn from in the future. You have to be Lincoln to say it and to adhere to it, but it's good advice that there has been a lot of wrong done, but for the future, it'd be better to try to learn from it than to revenge it.
One of the most enjoyable aspects of the book for me in both books, both this and the past book, is being a history and politics person, is the way you almost seamlessly integrate current analysis and events and developments with the historical record, going back to Lincoln and going back to Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter, and talking about those and how they provide, cautionary tales or examples that we should learn from today. So I think you did a fantastic job with that. I have a couple of questions from the audience, David, that I thought I'd put to you as we kind of start to wrap this up. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. So I saw you talk again on Greater Boston about this, but one of the audience members wants to know, given that Trump is going to lose by, or is likely to lose on a balance of probabilities, to use your words, that the window of vulnerability between the election and the Electoral College vote. What if Trump refuses to leave or refuses to allow throws doubt on the election? What are the worst and best case scenarios in that that vulnerable time? Well,
let me direct that reader and anyone, or that listener and anyone else has that similar question, to an article I wrote for The Atlantic. One or two articles back, you'll find it on my homepage on The Atlantic, which was described a wargaming scenario that I and about 60 other people went through in June, where we played out some of these scenarios. And the way it worked was we created a number of teams. There was a Trump team, there was a Biden team, there was a Republican electeds team, which was separate, a Democratic electeds team, which was separate. We had a team of judges, we had a team of federal bureaucrats, we had a team playing the military. And we all tried to, in different situations where the margin of victory was greater or less, tried to plan out things that would happen. So here's the best news from this, is once there is a clear legal statement that Donald Trump has lost, it is literally impossible for him to stay on as president after an adverse result in the Electoral College. Once that happens, and it happens, there are two meetings, one in the state capitals on December 14th, and then one in Washington, D.C. on January the 6th. But the state capital result is the binding one. So once it is certified on December 14th, and there's a mini deadline of December 8th, really by December 8th, certainly by December 14th, there's a winner of the election. And if it's not Donald Trump and he tries to stay in the White House, he just won't be president anymore. I mean, he may be in the White House. He may refuse to leave. He may create an awkward landlord-tenant problem. But the officer with the nuclear football will walk away. Donald Trump will have no more signing authority. And Biden, if it is Biden, wherever Biden is, he will be the president. It doesn't matter whether you're in the White House or not. You are the president and the whole system. So the moment of danger is from, right? Or maybe Nancy Pelosi. But right. You can create. Biden will, once the Electoral College speaks, Biden's the president. Okay. So what can Trump do harm? Well, there are a number. First, that you can create chaos and confusion in the period between the vote and December 8th, the deadline to wrap up dilemmas, and December 14th, when the electors meet in the states. Second, you can throw the transition process into chaos, and that's a thing that is a stark contrast. In 2008, the United States had another election in another crisis, and Barack Obama won. And one of the reasons that we got through the crisis as well as we did was, between them, Bush and Obama ran what is generally regarded as the best and most smoothest and most respectful transition in American history. The Obama people were brought into key meetings, so they were completely informed. They kept silent through the meetings, respecting the one president at a time rule. So we know what's going on, but we say nothing, it's your decision. And then wherever he could, Bush made decisions that were aimed at getting through the United States through the next 90 days. so as not to bind. So should we keep the car industry? Should we save the car industry? Should we kill it? What should we do? And Bush said, give them enough money for 90 days. So Obama will inherit a living car industry. If he wants to kill it, he can.
Right.
If he wants to save it, he can. But I'm not making either of those decisions. Just they get 90 days worth of money. And there are just a series of things like that. And a lot of the extraordinary personal goodwill that you see between the Obama and Bush families to this day dates from that remarkable transition.
Right.
Well, we're in another crisis. We're not going to have anything like that. I mean, in one of our scenarios, I can say this because I was playing Donald Trump in this one. On the day after the election, I went into a narcissistic pout and I moved the government to Mar-a-Lago and refused to talk to anybody. I just and just threw it up and just said, like, no, I'm not doing it. I'm sorry if you've hurt my feelings, that you're unworthy of me. And so you worry about things like that, and then you worry about how does Biden govern if Trump has used the transition to convince a third of the country that the election's illegitimate, that Biden's not a real president. How do you get people to do the health measures they need to do if they're recommended by a president that Donald Trump is telling his devoted base is an imposter?
Yeah, when it's funny you would say he's going to pout and he's just going to ignore the result. I reminds me of a question I asked you in 2018, not about Trump specifically, but I was asking about Robert Mueller and the investigation. Yeah. And I said to you, can Donald Trump just shut this investigation down? And your response at that point in the summer of 2018 was, it's getting harder and harder. And as we now know, while he didn't shut it down, with the help of at least one friend, he was able to largely ignore it. And so, he has a pattern of, mirroring his behavior over and over.
But some of that was Robert Mueller's fault. And I write about that in Trumpocalypse. And Jeffrey Toobin has a new book coming out that goes into much greater detail on the same thing. Yeah. Is that Mueller, I said in Trumpocalypse that if curiosity killed the cat, Bob Mueller's cat can look forward to a full and healthy life, because he just kept running into things that any normal person would say, well, that's odd. If Christopher Colombo had been on if Lieutenant Colombo had been on the case, and we said, why were the Russians so determined to make Donald Trump president? Right. What was in it for that? Why? That's a suggestive question, and Mueller never asked it.
Just one more thing, right? That's Colombo. So I had another question from a thing about a current event that still hasn't yet happened, and you may not want to comment it specifically, but maybe even more generally. I think it goes to the how the Democrats could lose chapter of your book, yeah, which is the possibility of a vice presidential pick, and an unusual, potentially historically unusual vice presidential pick.
Yeah. Well, is a very important vice presidential pick, not because of the election. I think almost all political scientists, like your own specialty, tend to converge on the answer that vice presidential picks don't matter very much for the election. The voters who decide the election are barely aware of who the vice president is. And maybe this time it'll be slightly different. Maybe it'll help to mobilize Black voters a little bit more if he chooses a Black woman rather than a white woman. I don't know about that. The important part of this vice presidential pick, and it's a very awkward conversation to have in that room, I am sure, is that Joe Biden will be by far the oldest person ever elected. If he is elected president, will be by far the oldest. He will be 77 on election day, 78 on inauguration day. And not just the oldest, but the oldest taking office in the middle of a pandemic that is especially lethal to older people. So he has to calculate not just that the person he picks is going to be an enormous power in Democratic politics in the 2020s, but it's awkward. He has to understand the person he picks may be president fairly soon, either because Biden is sick or something worse. And so it is, as a governing pick, it is hugely consequential. And unfortunately, the people who make these decisions tend to think about politics, but this is a case where they really need to think about government.
Right. So if you write a third book and it becomes a trilogy, what would the third book be called?
I was on a podcast with Clay Aiken, whom we all remember from American Idol, right, and he asked the same question, but he had the answer waiting for me. So I will use his wit, and then okay.
I got one.
His suggestion was Trump carceration.
Oh, okay.
What is yours?
Well, I think Trump carceration presumes he's going to lose. And I think if he loses, there might not be much of a book. But if he were to win, there might be. And in which case it might be Trumporama. I don't know, like a carnival, kind of a Trump.
Well, I'll tell you, I have been, because it's summer and I'm in Prince Edward County, and this is what I do when I'm here, I have been working on a project that may become another book, and it's got nothing to do with Trump at all. And it's a very different kind of book. This is, I want to address this question of how do countries with imperfect pasts, i.e. all of us, how do we properly memorialize our past and without doing violence to who we are as people. So I've been working on a project on that, and if I'm about halfway through it, and if I look back on it, this is one where there's no book deal, but if it looks publishable, then that will be the next thing I do. No more Trump, I hope to goodness.
Well, that sounds like a really relevant topic. I know that there's people here in the county, given the issues that we've been facing, that would be interested.
One of the chapters starts with a discussion of Picton, Ontario. So
okay. Well, in fact, you know what? I'm doing something similar. I think I told you about a book on Nixon and his visit to Picton in 1957.
Yes. I'm so excited to read that.
Yeah, and he came with an American senator who was the one person responsible for the opposition to the integration of the schools in 1957. And so, of course, he comes, and the case that was not Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, it was Davis and Prince Edward County of Virginia. So there's these, consistencies. We just had a huge Black Lives Matters protest on Main Street in June. And so, these issues continue to be things that we have to face from generation to generation, and it's part of our imperfect nature. So, I look forward to reading your book, and if I ever get around to finishing this, I'll send you
finish it. Now the world's waiting for it.
Yeah.
All right, wonderful to talk to you.
Thanks very much, David.
And thanks to everyone in Prince Edward County, and thanks for their attention to the work and to joining this call this afternoon.
Okay, thanks very much. Best to your family.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. My name is Alexandra Bake, and once again I have the honour, as Chair of the Picton Library Expansion Fundraising Committee, to thank both David Frum and Dr. Thomas Harrison for a fantastic afternoon of conversation. For those of you that were fortunate enough to attend the sold-out event at the Regent Theatre in 2018, where Thomas and David discussed Trumpocracy, this was a fascinating way to follow up and learn from a masterful observer of President Trump how we can move forward in a positive way. Thank you so much for your insight, David, and for your skill in navigating the challenges of Zoom. And to you, Thomas, thank you once again for the wonderful conversation. And I commend you both on mastering the art as dictated by COVID restrictions. We at the Picton Library Expansion Project are deeply grateful to both of you for your generosity towards our project and for shedding light on this very topical issue. Thank you.